Matty Fresh on the track up at State. And I'm bringing to you live my boys Alec and Nate. Tequila Ty, Jay, Nelly, and Zillin in the building. So kick it back, pour the drink. We chillin' because I'm boozing and betting and ballin' like I'm 2-6. And the blue kicks, watch me move quick. Yeah, this the blueprint. So who's getting involved? Welcome into the show. This is Booze, Bets, and Ball, baby.
And welcome back to Booze, Bets, and Ball, Penn State football podcast brought to you by Big Banter Sports. So the guys are off this week. Everyone was kind of traveling, leaving the Penn State game. So my friend Rick has decided to call in on his drive home from work to help us break down Penn State losing yet again to Michigan. So we're going to get into this right now, starting with, well, look at this, because it once again was not the greatest thing in the world, as Penn State's offense only put up 15 points, and that is kind of why there's no longer an offensive coordinator in Happy Valley with Penn State, as they put up just 15 points, and Mike Yurcich is gone. Drew Aller, 10 of 22 for 70 yards and a touchdown. Pretty similar, honestly, to the showing he had at Columbus. Obviously, more yards, but there was a lot more pass attempts in there, 20 more, and a lot more garbage time numbers too, honestly. But Michigan did not respect Penn State at all, to the point where they did not throw a pass in the second half because they didn't want to risk losing yards on a sack, a strip sack where Penn State could get good field position, or an interception or pick six. So Rick, what were your thoughts watching yet another downfall of the Penn State offense in a big game?
It's a miserable experience watching these games against the big opponents. Frankly, they're really the only two games that matter on the schedule. I mean, you're expected to beat the Rutgers, the West Virginias, the Delawares, and UMasses of the world, but playing in these games, you expect to rise to the competition. And if there was a year to get both of these programs, it was this year. All of last year we were hearing, next year's the year. Well, next year's here, and we laid two big eggs. Now, the scoreboards are not, you're down by 8 against Ohio State and you lose by 9 against Michigan. It's not like massive blowouts like you had last year against Michigan, for example. But they were just brutal games to watch. We did not impress. And frankly, if I'm an offensive recruit on the sideline of either game, I'm questioning my decision if I want to come to Penn State or not, sadly with the showing they had the last couple of games against their two massive opponents here.
Yeah, I think that's the frustrating thing is last year, I know Ohio State scored, via some turnovers last year against Penn State, and that kind of ran up the score. But both these teams went over 40 against Penn State last year. And pretty much, if you don't count that Michigan touchdown where Penn State went forward on a 4th and 6 where they shouldn't have once again and gave Michigan a short field, and they scored right away, you pretty much held Ohio State to 20 at their place, and you held Michigan to 17, and you still found a way to lose both of those games when you cut the scoring of both of these teams from last year by 20 points. I mean, it's just really sad to see that you couldn't even manage 3 touchdowns in either of these games. You didn't even really manage 3 touchdowns combined, honestly. So it was quite the bad showing from that aspect.
But both of the touchdowns, both games featured, I don't want to say garbage time touchdowns, but touchdowns once the game was pretty much already decided. So
yeah, the games were exactly the same, honestly. Penn State couldn't score a touchdown, but the defense was keeping them in the game. The offense goes for it on an ill-advised 4th down, doesn't get it. The other team goes right back down and scores quickly, and then Penn State scored a garbage time touchdown.
Yeah. I mean, it's 12 points and 15 points in both those games, 6 of them at least, were garbage time touchdowns. That does not bode well for your offensive coordinator keeping his job. And I think that's where we are today. A change had to be made. If you were at the game, even if you were on TV, watching on TV, there were a lot of boos, of boos. Every time we would do a 3 and out, every time a bad play call would take place, and it was getting pretty ugly to the effect of if nothing had changed, I think you're looking at a really ugly game against Rutgers this coming weekend. I think you're going to have a lot of ticked off fans that either aren't going to show up, or the ones that do show up are going to be pretty vocal like they were last week, even if they're handling Rutgers, which they should fairly easily.
Yes, kind of just getting into that, kind of bearing the lead here in a sense. But Sunday morning, then Penn State fired offense coordinator Mike Yurcich. Yurcich 0-6 against Michigan and Ohio State. He joins John Donovan under Franklin as the offensive coordinators to beat neither during their time here. So he has that going for him, I guess. But just another brutal offensive showing in a big game. And a lot of people are like, oh, they still were going in the game, at least they were still averaging 40 points a game. But like you mentioned, it's a 2-game schedule for Penn State. I know that'll change next year when the Big Ten expands, obviously. But, as to this date, it's been a 2-game schedule, and he hasn't shown up in either of those games for 3 straight years now. So the change had to be made, and it's a little frustrating, I guess, because Franklin kind of touted Yurcich as the guy to get us over the hump, where he was like, oh, this is my number one guy, the guy I always wanted, where he, begged the school to buy out Kirk Shiraka and bring in Yurcich. And now kind of, it's hard to judge Shiraka, I guess, because of the COVID year and all the injuries they had, but kind of gone backwards in a sense offensively under Yurcich when he was supposed to be the next level guy.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand what led to Yurcich being here. I'm no Kirk Shiraka fanboy or enthusiast. Frankly, I don't really have much of an opinion on him, positive or negative. I know that 2020 year was tough for a variety of reasons, right? Your team meetings take place over Zoom. Coaching is very limited, but it was borderline. I don't want to say unprofessional, but it was not the most professional move to bring in an OC, have him move his family to State College, and then after 9 games in a COVID season, boot the guy out, and then you bring in Yurcich, which, okay, he's the guy that Franklin has said he's always wanted, which is hitching his wagon to Yurcich. If Yurcich doesn't work out, that looks pretty poor on Franklin.
Right.
And then in 2021 the offense was not good. We couldn't run the ball at all. And then 2022 last year, it was better. For the most part, you had running backs featured that were breaking runs left and right. You had a decent receiving core that was doing the job, and you had some good tight ends as well. One of them got drafted and is playing in the NFL now. And then this was supposed to be the year to take the step forward. You had two running backs that were all Big Ten caliber backs. You had a tight end room that James Franklin has repeatedly every year the last 3 years touted as one of the deepest and best in the country. And you finally have an offensive line that I don't think they're world beaters, but I think it's clearly the best offensive line Franklin has had in his 10 years here.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have your guy, your 5-star number 1 overall recruit at quarterback. Frankly, if the receivers are weak, fine. You have a lot of other pieces there, running back, offensive line, quarterback, tight ends, that you should be able to look a little more proficient than, frankly, a garbage offense against the 2 big teams on your schedule. So really disappointing year this year for Yurcich and company.
Yeah, and I kind of want to talk about the positional coaches, and I know you kind of just talked to the receivers, but Jawan Sider, who is now the offensive coordinator, by the way, what the running back coach as well. What's going on with Nick Singleton? 13 for 43 on Saturday. That's a 3.3 average. We're talking about a guy that averaged 7 yards a run last year. He has just not been the same. 134 carries and 523 yards, which is a 3.9 average. So his average is almost cut in half from last year. I know there's some videos that came out today of him just missing wide open holes in between the tackles. The vision is just not there with him. It feels like he's really good out in space. When he hits the hole, he's gone. When he bounces one out, he could go down the sideline and no one's going to catch him. But I don't know what you do with him, because he clearly can't see what he's doing between the tackles, running the ball. And, the way Penn State runs the ball with pretty much out of the shotgun a lot, where these guys aren't getting a head of steam running downfield before they get the ball. There's just a lot going on here. And I think you got to find an offensive coordinator that's also going to work with Singleton and the rest of these running back skill sets. We're talking about finding someone with Aller, but the running backs I think are equally important in this debate.
Yeah, I think you answered your question as you were talking there. You kept saying running between the tackles, couldn't find a hole, couldn't explode through the tackles.
Right.
What was the difference last year when he was putting up I think he had 1,000 yards rushing last year. He was bouncing it to the outside. That's where Keytron Allen is very good between the tackles. He could pick up between 3 and 7 yards pretty consistently on first down. For whatever reason, he's slippery and he works well between the tackles. Singleton's never been a guy who's just great between the tackles. Last year, they were saying he bounced it out to the outside a lot, which in a lot of cases really helped him, break those long runs. I'm thinking of the one against Utah and a couple other ones, and they were trying to coach into him, kind of stay more in the system, keep it inside, don't always bounce it outside. But what is he best at? Offensive coordinator is supposed to put your skill maker or your skill position players, your playmakers in positions where they can succeed. What's he good at? He's good at bouncing it to the outside, not running into the your left guard every single time. The running game was just completely unimaginative. Of just 80% of the runs were just right up the middle. And that's not his skill set. You got to get him out in space, run an actual screen pass, bounce him outside, pitch it outside, just something different. And they kind of they called the same plays for the two different running backs, despite them having different skill sets. I think when you have Allen in there, you can go more inside. If you have Singleton in there, you can bounce it more outside. But it was just, they don't really care who's in there. They're going to call the same plays regardless, which is not setting your players up for success.
Yeah, definitely. And I know, like I talked about this and tweeted it, but I think they ran a screen maybe against West Virginia with Singleton. Since then, I can't remember a time they kind of made an asserted effort to get him in space with the ball, whether it be a screen. I don't think I've seen a toss or pitch play in the 2 years he's been here. So I just, it's negligence, not using his talents to their full ability and trying to make the running game cookie cutter despite different style running backs. So that really bothered me this weekend more than a lot of past weekends, but this was kind of the straw there, I think, with me. But so the receivers, the leading receiver was tight end Tyler Warren with 2 catches for 25 yards. Oh my gosh. This was bad. There's no number one with this receiver group. And it kind of showed in the Ohio State game that the big difference was one team had Marvin Harrison Jr., the other didn't. This was even worse. I mean, you had nobody that could do a thing. These guys cannot get separation, and they're not even, I know they don't take a lot of shots downfield, but none of these guys are even athletic enough to go get a jump ball that a Chris Godwin, Mike Yurcich, Allen Robinson, the stuff those guys would do. Like, this is just a really bad group.
Terrible, but you have to try, though. That was
right.
One of the beat reporters, Corey Geiger, caught a lot of flack a couple of weeks ago by essentially insinuating to Franklin in one of his Tuesday press conferences, why don't you just chuck it deep? Well, what happens when you chuck it deep? Now, you scheme something up. You don't just literally throw it deep and pray. But when you're in the stadium, maybe it's harder to see on TV. When you're in the stadium, you see the safeties creeping up towards the line of scrimmage. You see the linebackers creeping up. Part of the reason the running game isn't that great this year is because I think they're playing in a phone booth. I think the safeties are up. They don't respect the deep threat because you have this 5-star quarterback with a rocket arm who's dinking and dunking. His average yards per catch is something like 3 yards or something in the 2 games that matter. It's just these little tiny passes, so they don't feel like the safeties need to respect the deep threat. Even if you don't complete the deep threat, just the threat of it possibly coming over the top at some point makes room for everyone else to operate. When you're constantly playing in a phone booth, whether it's the running backs, the receivers, or whomever, it's tough. And frankly, I don't think there's any really good receiving threat on our team. Even the tight end room, they're just average. They're not.
They are, yeah.
Franklin touts them and says, "Oh, they're so great." And I think you have a lot of stars in terms of recruiting stars in that room. Some of them are younger, and we'll see how they develop. Then you have Keandre Lambert-Smith, who, he's made a big deal last year about he's excited to be the number one. Well, what does he have, like 750 yards? But how many of them come against UMass and Delaware, right? Like against actual competition, the guy's missing in action.
Yeah.
No separation. A lot of them are on the smaller end of things, size wise. So that's not great. You missed the Godwins of the world. Number 11, Malik McLean's a larger receiver, but he can't see the field anymore after having a decent outing at West Virginia. I don't know what the issue is there, but yeah, receivers are tough, and you saw frustration. I think Aller doesn't trust him, so I don't think he trusts to throw deep when he doesn't know if his running back's going to run the right route. I think Penn
Yeah.
State was about to go for it at one point in the second half on fourth down, somewhere near midfield, and you could tell Cephas had no idea where to go.
Yeah.
And so Franklin called a timeout, and then he thought better of it and said, maybe we should actually punt the ball, and they ended up punting. But that kind of stuff can't happen against these kind of programs. Like you don't see that happening on the Ohio State side or the Michigan side. I mean, that's just completely inexcusable. I don't know if it's coaching. I don't know if it's just the players not being accountable to themselves. But if you're a coach and you can't motivate your receivers to learn the playbook, and man, it's tough. This is probably the worst crop of receivers I can ever remember in the modern era of Penn State. They're just brutal.
Yeah, I think Keandre Lambert-Smith will, maybe be on an NFL roster, but this is the first time, and I'm not that old, obviously, but this is like the first time in a really long time that I can remember there not being a shoe-in NFL talent in the receiver room where like you knew that guy was at least, fifth rounder better. And I just don't see it this year. And, you talk about Aller being frustrated. I think the fact that these guys, are not being consistent and the coaching staff is constantly having to tweak the starting lineup and having different guys out there all the time because these guys just aren't consistent players. That's got to get on Aller because, he's a young guy. He's the first time starter too. And he can't build any chemistry with these guys because the same damn guys can't stay on the field long enough for him to get to that point. And I think that's another problem that is totally screwing them in the passing game is that quarterback can't trust them if he doesn't know their tendencies because they're not on the field enough.
Yeah, you clearly need to supplement that room in the offseason with transfer portal kids. Now they have some freshmen coming in, but it takes a while to develop. He was asked, Franklin was asked a question by, I think it was again Corey Geiger today at the press conference, and they said, is the offense as simple as boiling it down to the receivers stink? Essentially what he was asking. And Franklin was like, no, it's a lot more complicated than that. We're confident in our receivers. We like what we have. We just got to play more consistent. If I'm Franklin, I'm out there running billboards across the country. Hey, are you a stud receiver? Come to us. Come play at Penn State next year because we need help. And that's really kind of the era of the transfer portal. You have to be able to attract these guys. These stud receivers. Who was the kid who went from Michigan State last year? Was it Keon Coleman to Florida State? And he's an absolute stud now. You have to land one of those guys. And frankly, if I'm any sort of receiver right now, thinking about transferring and Penn State's on my list, if I turn on the tape and watch those two games, I am probably Penn State's not too high on my list as somewhere to go to get drafted under Yurcich's control. So this next OC hire is going to be really, you got to have some cachet behind this one. It can't just be some random guy off the street. It's like, oh, he was good at Eastern Michigan University. You need a guy with a big name who can really attract the kind of talent that you need to get to that next level here.
Yeah, definitely. And that also kind of brings in the whole NIL conversation too. Is this school set up to attract these guys, not just with on the field play, but with NIL packages? Because, like we saw with Jordan Addison a couple of years ago, going from Pitt to USC, a little money incentive helps along with playing with someone like Caleb Williams. So, that's something else to keep in mind. And hopefully they get that figured out along with a offensive coordinator they can trust because both.
Yeah, I don't know if NIL is a big of a problem. I think Franklin always likes to say it's a problem because he likes to motivate people to give money, right? That's his job. I think even the top NIL program in the world is going to say they're not where they need to be just because they don't want donations to dry up, right? But he's able to recruit high school kids. Like you don't land Drew Aller and Ethan Gruggemeyer, highly recruited quarterbacks without some sort of competitive NIL package. Now, I think Penn State does it maybe a little differently than Texas A&M in the world, where they don't just offer them a bag of cash to come to school. But they're putting together good high school classes. It's just all the receivers they're recruiting, for whatever reason, the way they scout them, the characteristics they're looking for on tape in high school, they're just not panning out.
Yeah, it's a little bleak right now, honestly, but Penn State has to come back Saturday and play Rutgers in the final home game of the season. So we'll come back later in the week with the Rutgers pod of Big Banter Sports and bring you guys some insight on the Scarlet Knights, who honestly aren't that bad this year. So it might be a little interesting with Penn State's playoff balloon fully deflated right now, what the motivation level will be like, player, coaches, fans alike on Saturday. So that's been an interesting dynamic, but we'll get into that later in the week. A big thanks to Rick for hopping on here, giving me a nice bullpen piece to work with the guys all traveling. So I appreciate that, Rick.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You got it. All right, so we will see you later in the week.